being here, and thank you to Ashu, Grace, and Stephanie for helping Nayanika get here across the pond and up from Princeton as well. So where she is currently on a year-long fellowship. Yeah. Okay, so I just want to kind of thank you all for being here this afternoon and on a Friday, as I am sure it's a difficult task to be here on a Friday afternoon. But thank you very much for being here. And when Zehra Hashmi, my co-organizer for this series of events that we are going to actually host at Brown, sponsored by the newly framed Saxena Center for India, Contemporary South Asia, we wanted to kind of engage in a discussion on ethnographically studying the state, moving away from the abstract ideas of state function and state capacity building in different parts of South Asia. We wanted to kind of turn the discussion towards a methodological dimension of how is it that we can think and conceive of the state. So in that regard, I think that Nayanika Mathur, our distinguished guest here today, is one of the key thinkers and also anthropologists who's been essentially leading the way in ethnographically studying the state. I want to extend my thanks and thanks on behalf of Zehra and me. And I wanted to kind of also tell you all about the project that Nayanika is currently working on, and she's going to talk about with us today. She has worked on these two beautiful books, that Paper Tiger, Law, Bureaucracy, and Developmental State in Himalayan India, which I think was one of the key books which introduced us to ethnographically studying the state in South Asia. And secondly, I think a particularly more interesting book, which is Crooked Cats, Beastly Encounters in the Anthropocene, which talks about the bureaucracy dealing with capturing or of big cats in the Himalayan region. She's currently working on two new projects. The first project explores the relationship between technology and government, which builds upon her first book, Paper Tigers, and her abiding interest in bureaucracy, welfare, and the techniques of government in South Asia, but substantially extends it from moving into a study of utopia, technology, and intersection of technocracy and politics. The second project is centered upon asking what the climate crisis does to the production of knowledge in anthropology, specifically, and humanities and social sciences more broadly. And considering the large number of students here who are interested in engaging seriously with the climate crisis and how the variety of authorities that deal with the climate crisis today think and conceptualize about it, I think there is going to be an engaged conversation about this talk today over here. Thank you so much, Nayanika, for sharing your work with us.
Thank you so much, Sangeeta, for that really lovely introduction. And thank you to Zehra and Sangeeta for inviting me here, and the South Asia Center for hosting me. And a particular thanks to Grace and Stephanie for absolutely wonderfully, making sure it was all very smooth and being really hospitable through it. I should also say that, I should have perhaps, listening to the series and listening to the kind of work that's happening here over lunch on some of the things the grad students are working on, I think I should have perhaps talked about some of my earlier work, which is actually very much centered within the ethnography of the state in India. And that was part of my first book, Paper Tiger. But perhaps a bit more selfishly today, I want to talk about something I'm only beginning to work on, something that I really I'm interested in exploring further, and I would love to get your thoughts on that right now. This talk today comes out of my recent book, which has just come out, Crooked Cats, but it takes it further by thinking about method in anthropology, and it takes it further by asking what it means to produce academic knowledge in this moment in time when we're all living in the climate emergency. This talk today comes out of my long-standing research in a North Indian state called Uttarakhand, which is largely a Himalayan state. And my two books have been largely set in that region. But some of the, but this talk sort of also extends some of the concerns here. Now, I'm going to very briefly talk about my book Crooked Cats because that sort of sets the stage for what I'll be talking about now. Now, Crooked Cats aims to retell the story of big cats that make prey of humans in India in light of the climate crisis. It makes a case for framing human, non-human relations against the backdrop of the climate crisis, and it uses the Anthropocene as an analytical frame to do so. I'm going to touch upon both how I understand the climate crisis and what I mean by the Anthropocene in my talk. But the central question that is going to occupy this talk today is that of how academic writing, especially anthropology, can capture the reality of the unfolding climate crisis in the Indian Himalaya. This talk today is about how we write and talk of fraught times, how we discuss spaces that are becoming increasingly difficult to imagine into being, not just due to the complexity and pain for, again, social scientists of all forms have powerfully written on such themes, but because they're unprecedented, unsettled, and profoundly uncertain. I want to ask what happens when the knowledge that one is producing is not form in a ability, but rather is foundationally uncertain, and it arises from a ground which is quite literally, in the case of my own ethnographic site, slipping and sliding away. When it becomes clear that the entangled, multi-scalar realities of a planet in crisis cannot be adequately comprehended without establishing more robust conversations with other knowledge forms, so not just with the arts and the humanities, but also with the natural sciences. Now, in my own recent work, taking on board this radical uncertainty and doing this work of scale shifting, and in particular, a deeper engagement with other disciplines, including wildlife biology and climate science, has led to a re-seeing and a retelling of a more familiar story. It is this shift in perspective, such a take on the ethnographic project, that I wish to relate here today. So I will, in my talk, discuss the climate crisis and how it is making itself manifest in one part of India. I'm driven to do so through long-term engagement with a very particular place in the Indian Himalaya that I'm going to be talking about today, a place that is changing rapidly and can no longer, I believe, be understood outside of the climate crisis. So if we center the Himalaya, if we think from it, so to say, and take seriously the conditions of life that currently exist and the ever-present threat of death that permeates it, then what, I ask here, might an anthropology that writes in the Anthropocene consist of? So now, I'm sure many the term to signify an epoch in which human actions are shaping the planet so profoundly that they're now acting as a geological force. Up on the slide, I have one paper from one of the people who's sort of, Paul Crutzen, who's attributed as having coined this term. But of course, this is one version of what the Anthropocene is. There is just the term itself has generated a very fast and furious debate, and it won't be possible for me to dwell on this ever-expanding debate in detail today. But what I am going to do very quickly is lay out my take on it. So how do I understand the Anthropocene? And why do I think it might be productive? And how might we use it in some ways? Let me begin with some of the criticisms of the Anthropocene concept. And actually, I find the criticisms very compelling. In my own early work, I was very critical of it myself. But something has changed, which has made me rethink the Anthropocene and think that it might be a more productive frame to work through. But let's begin with the criticisms. So one of the big criticisms of the Anthropocene is that it originates in the natural sciences, which can lead to a domination by such a perspective. And it has the potential to eclipse out the humanities and the social sciences. That's one. Another sort of criticism of it is that it has the capacity to decenter the vital role played by both capital and by empire in the planetary crisis. And other people have argued that there's an assumption that there is a singularity to the anthropos, to humanity, and this runs almost forcibly counter to the anthropological project of very carefully parsing out who precisely it is we are talking about. And, of course, there's this whole other kind of criticism which is related to the commodification of the academy itself, with its periodic and increasingly dizzying new turns, its concepts, its isms, and its scenes now. And so, for this and for many other reasons, I was quite critical of the concept of the Anthropocene in the beginning, and I didn't really take it seriously. But then why am I coming back to it, and why am I now sort of thinking more deeply about what an anthropology for the Anthropocene might consist of? Sangeeta mentioned I'm in Princeton this year. I'm at the Institute for Advanced Study for a year, just starting a new project which is trying to understand what the climate crisis does to knowledge making, and particularly what does it mean for the discipline of anthropology. And as I said at the beginning, this paper today is an initial sort of version of what I think this wider project might become. So my intention here today is not to try to convince any of you of the usefulness of the concept, in the way that, for instance, Bruno Latour did in his AAA presidential address back in 2014, where he argued that the Anthropocene is a gift to the discipline. Nor is it my intention to spell out what an anthropology of the Anthropocene should consist of in the manner that someone like Amelia Moore has written of an Anthropocene anthropology, or Anna Singh and her collaborators of the Apache Anthropocene. My thinking on the Anthropocene, of course, is very much in conversation with and is inspired by a very remarkable body of work that has emerged in the recent past, including some of the people I just mentioned. But I want to particularly note here the critical scholarship on the Anthropocene that has made calls for its creative remaking from a geological category to one that is attendant to the histories and politics of colonialism, capitalism, and industrialization. I'm drawn to what I consider a fundamental premise of the Anthropocene concept, that a radical new form of interdisciplinarity is the need of the hour, and the comfortable disciplinary silos in which we have for perhaps too long sequestered ourselves are no longer tenable. This body of work has variously made calls for indigenizing or decolonizing the Anthropocene, and so this is sort of one body of work that I'm sort of influenced by. In addition, there's a very vast scholarship from environmental history, political ecology, and environmental sociology, and this has a particularly rich presence in South Asia. And in very important ways, this literature prefigures many of the more recent discussions on the Anthropocene. So what I'm going to be talking about today and what my work is sort of trying to bring together are these different kinds of perspectives together. Now, what I want to do is I want to draw upon this literature, and through this, I'm interested in crafting an ethical anthropological project that remains true to that which is folding in the Indian Himalaya. As I said, this interest has sort of come quite organically out of my work in this particular state in India. In particular, I've been guided by two characteristics that I find striking, both of which I will elaborate upon today. And I should say that I've been working in Uttarakhand now for over 15 years. I started my PhD in 2006, and I go back regularly, and I do field work there. And so much of what I'm talking about today is coming from seeing the kind of changes in this space. So the first thing that I find quite striking is there's this incessant talk of endings and the death of the Himalaya that emerge not just in relation to extreme events, but is also very much in evidence in everyday chatter. So, you'll be just sitting around and talking, and they'll be like, "Sab khatam ho raha hai, everything is finishing." And then there's a way in which there's a whole discourse around things finishing in the Upper Himalaya that I find permeating everyday life in a way that it didn't, say, when I started my fieldwork back in 2006. Secondly, and relatedly, I wish to center forms of storytelling that are narrated with regard to rapidly changing human-non-human relations. And this, again, is something that you will hear a bit about in a minute. Centering discussions of the dying Himalaya as well as stories of changing human-non-human relations has led me to quite profoundly reframe and rethink my own research and writing. Now, there's this whole, again, for any of you who's been sort of working on the Anthropocene or on environmental history or political ecology, you'll see that there's a whole new turn to storytelling, right? That we have to find new ways of telling stories. And I sort of prefer the term beastly tales over stories, for that is a more precise description of the types of stories that I sort of am working through. These are about beasts of all forms. They're about tigers, leopards, humans, the state, capitalists, bureaucrats, hunters, poachers, bears, dogs, deer, gods, and demons. But this phrasing is also play on the question of who is the real beast of the story, and that's something that I want to sort of think through ethnographically and historically. This phrase is, of course, borrowed with immense gratitude from the writer Vikram Seth, who has an utterly delightful collection of poems entitled Beastly Tales from Here and There. This book, I'm sure many of you have read it, but for those who haven't, it contains 10 animal tales, all in verse form, and they're all sorts of forms of morality tales resting upon unlikely animal relationships. Now, through an elaboration of beastly tales from the Indian Himalaya, I wish to make a case for an anthropology for the Anthropocene, by which I mean not just an academic practice that takes seriously this concept, but also which contributes to academic and public discussions on what it means to live in this epoch in which human activities are reshaping the planet we inhabit. So the Anthropocene, in my reading, names, questions, and hence undoes the received narrative of human mastery over nature. I see it running alongside conversations on the politics of academic knowledge production that are assuming different forms within Euro-American universities. So anthropologists have largely been conscious of whose voice we center in ethnographic work. Perhaps what we have been historically less attentive to is who gets to be heard, cited, considered authoritative as producing that which we term quote-unquote good anthropology, and are then allowed into the warm embrace of the we that we refer to when we talk of us anthropologists, as Liana Chua and I have previously discussed in an edited collection called Who Are We? Rethinking Anthropology. So for me, these two projects aren't distinct. So on the one hand, you have something called the Anthropocene that names something particular about this moment as it interrogates and thus undoes human conceit of planetary mastery and the political economy of knowledge making, as well as historical erasures of certain voices from within the academy. So in short, I see the Anthropocene as opening out vital questions on knowledge making. This includes how we frame our work and what role anthropogenic climate change plays in it, as well as what kinds of conversations can be established with the arts, humanities, and the natural sciences. How we write, what happens to that authorial voice when presented with a world that is shot through with existential uncertainty, what sorts of storytelling tools do we adopt, and who, whether interlocutors, peers, or colleagues from entirely different disciplines, we choose to center. Okay, so with this very long preamble, let us finally move to the Indian Himalaya, where this work is set and from where many of these arguments emerge. I will be speaking largely of what is occurring in a small district called Chamoli, which shares a long border with Tibet. And as I said, I've been working in this area since 2006. Though, of course, in more recent years, it's been a bit more difficult to return thanks to the pandemic and climate disasters and, one's life and the work and sort of the temporalities of academic life. Now, the Upper Himalaya could be easily termed a climate frontier or an ecological hotspot. While in many places in the world, the temporal orientation for the climate crisis looks to the near future, in this region, that future is very much already present. As Kyle White has demonstrated through his work on indigenous perspectives on climate change, the present time for some is already dystopian. This region has for long functioned as a resource frontier with a long colonial history of extraction, from timber to minerals to the damming of rivers and the poaching of non-human animals. Interestingly, also in the mountains of Uttarakhand, the anticipatory work of climate adaptation or mitigation that is being undertaken by states and NGOs is still largely absent. So this makes it somewhat different from, say, the Sundarbans, the mangrove forests in India and Bangladesh, where significant investments are being made to reshape landscapes in response to climate change, with, as a spate of terrific recent ethnographic works are showing, mixed and unanticipated results. Instead, what we are witnessing up here is an accelerated process of destruction in the name of development. There are large hydropower dams, road expansion schemes, and other such mega infrastructural projects that take forward, if not greatly accelerate, the ecocidal logics of colonialism. The climate crisis is present in a variety of ways in this little Himalayan state. To wider publics, it would appear to flash up periodically through what are described as disasters. In particular, a disaster that unfolded near Kedarnath, in the temple of Kedarnath in June 2013, continues to haunt this region. This was, in the language of climate science, an extreme event, Following several days of unremitting monsoon rain and cloudbursts, flash floods inundated several regions of Uttarakhand. In addition to the uncharacteristically fierce monsoon behavior, a contributing factor to the floods was the moraine left behind by a retreating glacier. The monsoon rain filled the rock debris reservoir of the moraine and soon it overflowed to join the rising river. It was the combined force of the two that led to the raging floodwaters. Officially, 6,054 people were declared dead, even though the unofficial accounts put the death toll closer to 10,000. The flash floods that extended well into the plains affected millions of people, destroyed houses, bridges, and infrastructure, and stranded over 300,000 pilgrims and tourists in the mountains. In a region where one disaster or another now forms the norm on a seasonal, if not daily basis, this 2013 event is marked out as exceptional. Even in the otherwise prosaic bureaucratic language of the Indian state, it has been termed a Devei Apatta, or a divine disaster. The 2013 disaster was considered divine partly because of the scale of the destruction, which can only be wreaked by gods and demons. As eyewitnesses and residents of Uttarakhand describe and remember it, the floods and rains were of such ferocity that it could only ever have been retribution by nature. So the highest number of casualties and the greatest amount of damage took place in this town of Kedarnath, which is centered on an ancient Shiva temple, apparently from the 8th century AD, and is considered holy by Hindus. Witnesses describe hearing a very huge snapping noise followed by a gigantic wall of water descending on the Kedarnath temple and its surroundings. Miraculously, a huge boulder got logged behind the temple, protecting it from significant damage. The location of the temple and its strong construction also protected it. This protection was not at hand for the surrounding buildings that were swept away in the flood. So an image that has become iconic of the divine disaster was taken much further downstream from Kedarnath in the town of Rishikesh. In it, we see the flooding Ganges River partially submerging a popular Shiva idol. With his closed eyes and beatific smile, it is as if Shiva the destroyer is resting at the end of his dance of rage. So when I wrote of the divine disaster in the immediate aftermath of the event, I considered it a chilling foreshadowing of the Anthropocene yet unseen, a world in which rivers, glaciers, mountains, clouds, humans, and gods would act with a hitherto unknown extremity, ferocity, and unpredictability. With time, however, it is clear that the divine disaster, or the Himalayan tsunami, as it is also referred to in the media, was not an isolated or even an exceptional event, the scale of its destruction notwithstanding. Rather, disasters are becoming, to use a word that I've used more for my research on bureaucracy, routinized. So again, just another example. Last year on February 7th, there was another disaster in the very same region. This was a smaller one in terms of human lives lost, but it had eerily similar visuals. I was then in Dehradun, the capital city of Uttarakhand, and my first inkling of the disaster was a WhatsApp forward from an old friend who lives in the region. In that video, one can see a deluge of water ripping through the valley. As the camera turns further away, it blasted. You can see the water is sort of blasting through a big dam there. And so in this video that this friend of mine sent me, you can hear someone saying in the background, almost with a flat calmness, "It's all gone, everything is finished. Sab kuch khatam ho gaya hai." The flood trapped over 200 workers in an area called Tapovan who were working in a tunnel. Many of these young men were buried alive. Others were swept away by the flood. With cruel irony, the village that was most violently affected was none other than Reni, the birthplace of the famed Chipko movement in the 1970s, in which women protested the commercial felling of trees by hugging them, and which has led to the term tree hugger to be deployed to refer to environmentalists. There was much talk of the ghosts that had emerged from the disaster. These were the souls of those who had been trapped alive in a tunnel and had died waiting to be rescued. Similarly, so of those whose corpses were never recovered, other than perhaps a limb here or a scrap of cloth there, and hence they never received a proper funeral. Comparisons were made here with the ghosts that continue to haunt Kedarnath well after the 2013 disaster. So subsequent studies tell us that almost 27 million cubic meters of material was put into a minute-long descent that at one point was in complete free fall. 80% of this material was ice and 20% was water. A story in the BBC reported it thus: when the mass hit the Ronti-Gad Valley flow, it released the energy equivalent to 15 Hiroshima atomic bombs. With the Chamoli disaster, there was a broader question among scientists, so amongst geomorphologists, glaciologists, etc., on whether a direct causation with climate change could be ascribed. The tentative suggestion from both a 50-author study in the journal Science, as well as an independent study by the Wadia Institute of Geology, is that there are linkages to climate change, though attribution would be harder. Both these studies recommend the installation of early warning systems in place. I've been working with these glaciologists and geomorphologists and geologists a bit, and it's fascinating for me to see the language of science that they take, the questions of attribution that they take on, the things through which they talk about, is this climate change, is it not, what is happening over here? And part of my project is to try to map these kind of knowledge-making practices onto other more traditional ethnographic material that I've been sort of collecting in this area for a while. Now, so as such, both the disasters, so that's the Kedarnath disaster, the divine disaster, as well as the more recent Chamoli disaster, share an analytical repertoire. They're discussed as GLOFs, so as glacial lake overflows, avalanches, flash floods, in both cases warming temperatures, melting glaciers, and the damming of rivers fed into the making of the disasters. Yet, in the scientific assessments that are undertaken after the disaster, there is a visible tussle with the question of whether what we are seeing are the effects of climate change, or is this simply the precarity of life in the Upper Himalaya, a young, unstable, mountainous, and seismic zone that is still growing. Both disasters also share a reliance on satellite imagery to explain what really happened, with, in the more recent case, swift analyses unfolding on Twitter. Now, these assessments, invaluable as they are, intersect as well as differ from an ethnographic account of the two disasters. For the majority of mountain persons, both the Divine and the Chamoli disasters were foretold, not because, like for the scientists who reconstructed the event ex post facto, the seismic activity, crumbling mountainscapes, and glacial breaches were known, but because this was all of a piece with what they have for long been describing as the death of the Himalaya, a place in which all life forms, be they human or non-human, are either dying or they're assuming beastly new forms. In lieu of focusing on the specific and exceptional moments of the disaster unfolding, they focus on the difficulties of the everyday as well as on livelihood concerns. Now, I should note that when I refer to mountain persons, I'm speaking of people who identify overwhelmingly as belonging to the mountains, or being Pahari. Most of them have lived here all their life. They work as street-level bureaucrats, as subsistence farmers, NGO workers, shopkeepers, journalists, the teachers, students living in the small towns of the district. And of course, this is a heterogeneous collective with some very important differences of subject positions and political opinions within it. However, for the sake of brevity, I'm glossing them here as Paharis say this and mountain persons say this, but there are differences within them. But I would also argue that there is something very strong about this identity of belonging to the mountains and of actually living within this place in this moment of time that allows, I hope, one to put forward a slightly more homogenized narrative like the one that I am going to put forward today. Now, everyday life and livelihood are becoming increasingly difficult in the mountains of Uttarakhand, and one of the big sort of indications of this is the springing up of ghost villages, or what are called bhutiya gaon, which are devoid of humans, and basically everyone, so this is just one example of one ghost village. It is estimated that anything between 1,750 to 7,000 ghost villages exist in Uttarakhand. And this is something, again, that I've seen a lot myself over the last 15, 16 years, where villages where I've gone and done fieldwork in, they're actually empty. I'll go back there and there'd be no one left there other than maybe a few people, or they've become bhutiya. They've actually literally become inhabited by ghosts in that sense. And when you go and sort of see what's happening here, you can see these very clear patterns where the depopulation of the Himalaya and its relationship to poverty, unemployment, and the climate crisis is quite clear, but I think it's not been studied perhaps as deeply as it should be. But the point I want to make here really is that what happened with the Chamoli disaster on 7th February 2021, or on June 16, 2013 with the Divine disaster, isn't divorced from the texture of everyday life, which is like the village of Reni that I just discussed before, headed for oblivion. So the strongest indication of the climate crisis in the Himalaya for many of its residents isn't necessarily in these big disasters that I've just touched upon. Rather, it is to be found in more mundane things, like the disappearance of the forests, rains that don't come on time, rivers that are no longer as full as they used to be, in the intense heat, and in animals that are misbehaving. And it's these beasts that I will now turn to. And this is in a way where, this is what I talk about in my book, Crooked Cats, as well. Now, the increasingly brazen behavior of big cats, which are leopards or tigers, has been a noticeable change in the Upper Himalaya. Leopards, which in the latest leopard census of 2018 put us counting approximately 839 on Uttarakhand and approximately 13,000 in India as a whole, in particular are discussed as misbehaved, as cheeky, and as crooked beings. They're being sighted in human-dominated landscapes, including big cities. They're increasingly losing fear of humans and aren't afraid to reveal themselves in broad daylight. They're attacking pet dogs and livestock, and most worryingly, are increasingly making prey of humans themselves. Such big cats are popularly known as man-eaters, and of course they have a very long history in India. However, across the board in the mountains, I was told that there is a spike in attacks by big cats. I take seriously the universal claim among my interlocutors in the Himalaya that big cats are acting in ways that are increasingly considered out of character. It is worth noting that more recent state statistics also show an upward trend in attacks by leopards on humans in Uttarakhand, but there is no reliable way to chart out the predatory behavior of big cats and the reported upswings in it over the long durée. My project here, and in the wider work that this talk is drawn from, is not to convince anyone of the veracity of these claims of crooked cats in the Himalaya, or even demonstrate any causality with the climate crisis. Rather, it is to take these claims of increasing crookedness seriously by exploring the lived reality of what it is to share space with potentially predatory non-humans, and by asking what these beastly tales of crooked cats might be telling us. Now, most big cats, tigers, lions, leopards, are simple or straightforward. They're considered Siddha Sadat, in the sense that they respect humans and are careful to avoid any unpleasant encounters with them. Yet, there are some specific big cats who have become crooked, or they become teda, and this is how they were sort of described to me. These are big cats that have gone off the straightforward path and are actively seeking out humans to make prey of them. Now, this begs the question of why do some big cats go crooked? And there are several theories that proliferate to explain this. Some refer to the idiosyncrasies of individual big cats, some to the bad karma or the misfortune of human victims themselves. However, the most dominant account of why big cats go crooked do so with reference to power, inequality, and human actions. Big cats themselves are described as more or less innocent. Rather, it is a specific type of human and the political economic structures that they have assembled over time that have brought us to this pass. A sympathetic stance towards crooked cats was discernible once they had been killed or captured, that is, with elaborate theories propounded to explain why they do what they do. Now, I want to pause for a moment to reflect on the manner in which beastly tales on crooked cats are related. They're highly speculative in nature, they proceed on a case-by-case basis, and they leave space for forms of uncertainty. Even as they trace complex connections across time, space, individuals, species, and politics, these accounts do not demur from accepting uncertainty at the heart of the tale. It is this uncertainty on crooked cats that leads to the dense proliferation of beastly tales on them, which squares with my understanding of the Anthropocene as a condition that is foundationally uncertain and unsure, a moment in time when our knowledge-making practices need to adapt in order to take on board these unknowns. One of the ways to do so, though by no means the only mode, is to craft new storytelling tools that allow for translation across domains that are too often kept separate from one another. Okay, so to return to theories on why certain big cats go crooked, a prominent account centered human violence against big cats. A large amount of killing and poaching of leopards and tigers has made them as a species and as individuals with particular biographies angry with humans. Thus, the many crooked cats that exist are nothing but the kin of the hunted, mutilated, and poached big cats who are seeking revenge on humans. This revenge is extracted by making prey of humans in the very same way that humans preyed on their ancestors or relatives. Interestingly, studies on North American cougars have indicated that the hunting of them leads to an increase in conflict between humans and big cats. So there is a generalized belief in the Himalaya too that the more you kill and hunt tigers and leopards, the more they will retaliate in kind. So Uttarakhand has a very high incidence of attacks by leopards, one of the highest in India. And this is often explained by reference to the long border the state shares with Nepal and Tibet, both places where poached animal parts are smuggled out too from India. The culpability of place, the practice of intense hunting, poaching, as well as the translocation of leopards, categorized as problem animals, were brought up as reasons that some individuals from this feline species are targeting humans. Equally, non-human animals seek retributive justice from specific individuals for the very particular actions, whatever those may be. So several stories of individualized retribution were related. For instance, there was famously a crooked leopardess who only hunted inebriated men because her own parent had been shot by one such man, or the story of a leopard that limped a little and was seeking revenge on the woman who had accidentally hurt him with a sickle in the farm when he was a cub. The limp and the individualized retribution reminds one, of course, of probably the most famous crooked cat of all, the tiger Sher Khan of Jungle Book fame. Another popular theory on why there's so many crooked cats in the Himalaya referred to the lack of indigeneity. These beasts are alien to the mountains, and their true provenance is located in the plains. When leopards grow old in the zoos in the plains people send them up to the mountains to die. Or when zoos get overcrowded with leopards, then too they ship them up to the mountains. As these zoo leopards are used to being provided with meals and some are in any case too old to hunt wild animals, they turn on the easiest prey of all, humans. As more and more rescue and rehabilitation centers for big cats are set up in India, the issue of overcrowding has extended to these spaces as well. But the belief that captured or zoo-accustomed big cats are sent up from the plains to the mountains has to be understood in the context of a historical mountains-plain animosity that dominates the politics of this impoverished borderland region. The release of old leopards and tigers from zoos into what plains people merely consider the jungle, with no heed paid as usual to the peril that this poses for its inhabitants, is considered just another item in a long list of actions by plains people that combine abuse and neglect of the mountain people. Now, there's a variant of this released from the zoo explanation for man-eaters that also has some traction in Uttarakhand. In this version, alien leopards have not merely been released from zoos or rescue centers and neglectfully sent up to the mountains. Rather, these man-eaters have been sent up with an actively malign intent to kill and destroy mountain people. The conspiratorial element in this explanation is explicit. There's a very similar discourse that is present in the neighboring Himalayan state of Himachal Pradesh, where several people told me straight out that crooked cats are objects of extermination controlled by the state. Similarly, many residents around the Sanjay Gandhi National Park in Mumbai believe that in the evening, the park authorities open the gates and leopards come out of the park to hunt and eat whoever they can find, from pet dogs to humans. So in studies of human-animal conflict around the world, such an intentionality behind the appearance of dangerous animals is often assumed, with most often the state being accused of a conspiracy to murder. Now, there's also the question of who the target of crooked cats are. Such beasts are believed across time and space to actively seek out certain categories of persons to prey on, even while they leave others untouched. So the ones who are most likely to be targeted tend to belong to minority or vulnerable communities. These are refugees, lower caste people, mountain persons, Adivasis, the poor, women. As Anuj Jale has also noted from her work in the Sundarbans, there are complex political and socio-economic reasons that make certain humans more likely to be victimized by crooked cats. These reasons run along axes of class, caste, gender, race, age, location, and nationality. Thus, crooked cats and their depredations allow for a bloodied mirroring of the wider inequalities of the world. Now, it is quite clear to almost everyone that a lack of alternative prey or the disappearance of the regular prey base of big cats are making them increasingly desperate, hungry, and predatory. This paucity of food was put into the language of climate change, as evidenced in extinction, biodiversity loss, degradation, but largely by local elites such as bureaucrats and NGO workers. Similar narratives on climate change causing what is referred to as human-wildlife conflict is put forth by wildlife writers, international conservation organizations, scientists, and the international media alike. So while my interlocutors in the mountains certainly made reference to the visible ecological degradation all around, and they particularly mentioned the vanishing of more regular prey as a major reason that leopards and tigers are becoming increasingly ravenous, there were different sorts of stories told, and the English language word climate change was rarely deployed. Indeed, climate change was largely only used by agents of the state and conservation NGOs to, in fact, take attention away from human action and rather operated as a tool of depoliticization. There was a shrugging of the shoulders and this reference to something much bigger than what one can control. It's just climate change after all. This attests to the need to remain attentive to the power of this concept to invisibilize precisely that which it needs to center. This also opens out the question of whether you need to speak in the language of climate change or the Anthropocene to be speaking of the processes that cause it. Ritodi Chakravarti and Pasang Sherpa similarly report from the fieldwork in the same region of the Himalaya, where a woman exasperately asked them, "But why are you so interested in the climate? The climate is not what oppresses us." This is a quote from their interview. Indeed, while not deploying the same language or words, the varied explanations for the increasing presence of crooked cats by long-term residents of the Himalaya carry nested stories and dense analyses within them. They're rooted in longer histories of resource extraction, the violence of the state and capital alike, and they're attentive to the manners in which class, caste, gender come to matter in such moments of time. Now, the debate here isn't over whether causality can be established with climate change or what technical inputs can be added to fix this, but it is a different way to tell a story of human destruction. If we read all these varying theories on and on why big cats become crooked together, we can see how human acts, hunting, translocation, actions undertaken in the distant past, merge with cosmology centered on reincarnation and retribution. At the same time, the role of the state in the use of political power, which comes across particularly strongly in the so-called conspiracy theories, are considered critical. History isn't separate from politics and religion, and there are complex interconnections that are constantly made by varied actors. This is, to my mind, the Anthropocene, that capacity of human actions to have such a huge impact that we are leaving a destructive human signature on the planet at work. This is in evidence through a coming together of empire, capital, ecology, the state, notions of karma and reincarnation, and the conceit of certain types of humans. So what I'm making a case for here is for understanding beastly tales as expressing powerful truths about the Anthropocene, as carrying what Alison Ford and Kari Norgaard have termed environmental subjectivities. Ford and Norgaard draw upon the work of Black feminist scholars and deploy Audre Lorde's concept of the mythical norm to center culturally specific climate knowledges, including those who, quote, frame climate change as symptoms of unsustainable political economic structures, end of quote. Now, some of you, people here work on South Asia. You might remember that, there was this extreme heat wave that we were sort of experiencing in India and Pakistan in the summer, where birds were quite literally falling from the skies. Now, accounts of what heat is doing to non-human animals in the Himalaya have been central absolutely from literally the first day since I started my research there. So bears, I was told, in particular, had been maddened by the heat in the Himalaya, and they had started acting in ways that were not explicable. They were ruining houses and farms, they were wantonly attacking humans. So recently, the Uttarakhand police had put up a Facebook post to explain robberies of food and grain from locked houses in the district. And they said that this had been undertaken by bears. And this became the stuff of much hilarity, and the police had to delete the post. But, I remember seeing this sort of on social media and everyone laughing at the police and saying, oh, look at them talking about these thieving bears. And I didn't actually find it funny, because the reality of crafty, scheming, thieving animals, whether these are leopards or bears, are absolutely central to this landscape. These non-humans go crooked, they thieve, they act in ways that constitute a radical break from the characters due to the slow but sure death of the Himalaya. But the question that when we would sort of discuss it, people would be like, but how else are they to behave given what the real beasts, which is humans, have done to the Himalaya, given that they, like us humans, also have to feed themselves and their families and forge ways to live in a dying landscape. Furthermore, elements like these bears were not separated out from the musk deer that had gone extinct despite the existence of a musk deer sanctuary for them. The musk deer, we were told by state accounts, were dying off because of the intense heat in the Himalaya. But mountain people were convinced that this ending came from poaching, hunting, and more crucially, an uncaring, neglectful state that cared to only have sanctuaries on paper, but didn't do the work required for it to be a meaningful reality. I could go on and on with these beastly tales, but we're sort of running out of time. For instance, I've not even mentioned the forest fires that are adding to that which is burning down the Himalaya. But let me here try to summarize what I'm arguing. And perhaps a short contrast between my take on the Anthropocene and where one might see climate change, even when it is not so labeled, and another account that has gained popular traction might be instructive. In a prominent intervention, the novelist Amitav Ghosh, who happens to hold a DPhil in anthropology, has railed against what he considers an astonishing failure to grasp the urgency of climate change. In his important 2016 book, The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable, Ghosh notes that although South Asia is, quote, extraordinarily vulnerable to climate change, and India is a country that is highly politicized with great amounts of indignation and outrage expressed on a wide range of issues, yet, he says, climate change has not resulted in an outpouring of passion in the country. Instead, he goes on to write, and I'm quoting him, quote, political energy in South Asia has increasingly come to be focused on issues that relate in one way or another to questions of identity, religion, caste, ethnicity, language, gender rights, and so on, end of quote. Now, my argument runs counter to Amitav Ghosh's. As I see it, questions of identity, as well as expressions of indignation and outrage on other political but not directly ecological or climatic issues, should be folded into discussions of the Anthropocene. As noted at the very outset of this talk, one of the early critiques of the Anthropocene was its capacity to flatten out precisely such issues of inequalities and different subject positions within the anthropos. In my reading, criticism of and a profound awareness of climate change abounds in the political. Those seemingly absurd narratives described here, big cats being shipped up to eat the natives or big cats turning on humans for the purpose of retributive justice, can and ought to be seen as angry commentaries on the wider politics and practices underpinning anthropogenic climate change. This, of course, enables us to open out the question of how climate change is anthropogenic, to see the Anthropocene in these narratives on human actions and culpabilities, in these beastly tales that are so easily dismissed or not even heard, rather than in graphs, IPCC reports, media articles, or other forms of knowledges that are typically used to describe this planetary crisis. As an ethnographer, I contend the unthinkability of the impending climate crisis that Ghosh finds in fiction. Perhaps the politicization that he's referring to are, for instance, the politics of hate and division of the ruling party in India right now, the Bharatiya Janata Party. This is a different order of the political from the many struggles that we're seeing across South Asia, or from the quotidian chatter of residents of the Himalaya, in which I discern several prescient accounts of the past, present, and future of human as well as non-human animals, like the endangered tiger and leopard. What these beastly tales depict are our naughty interspecies entanglements in the Anthropocene. A failure of the imagination is evident not, as Ghosh despairs, in the deep politicization of the world to the exclusion of an ecological focus. Rather, it lies in our inability to read these commentaries as intrinsically critical of the processes that cause and sustain global warming in the first place. Thank you.
Would you like these questions yourself?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm happy to do that.
Okay, mics. Questions, comments, and please, switch on the mic and then speak into it because it's being live streamed.
So there was a lot in there. It's like speeding through so much.
Okay. Should I start off? Okay. Hi, thank you, Nayanika, for that fantastic talk. And actually, while listening to this discussion of, the crooked cats and the teda janwar, essentially, I was wondering, and this is something that we talked about at lunch as well. So I was wondering the ways in which the kind of bureaucracies, as you are well aware of, the bureaucrats within these institutions are actually kind of making sense of these ideations and concepts that are floating in the common popular knowledge.
Right. Yeah, thanks, Sangeeta. Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting because, we also discussed the film Sherni over lunch, and there is a way in which one can't really understand or think about non-human animals and the lives they have and the way that they try to be conserved or protected or governed or killed without understanding this everyday life of bureaucracy or the ways in which conservation laws work through these bureaucratic institutions and the ways in which lower level street bureaucrats themselves understand what's happening there, or the ways they act on it. So actually in the book, I have 3 sections, which is really on the governance of non-humans, about how you identify them, how you come to know them, how you petition against them, how you govern them. And I think that aspect of the governance of the state, of governing these non-human beings, is absolutely central to also trying to understand the climate crisis. That we can't actually think about this everyday life of bureaucracy as distinct from this bigger planetary crisis, the ways in which that is feeding into, and vice versa. It's part of this, the social world, so to say. Yeah, so I mean, it's really interesting to, again, while we were talking with lunch, I was really thinking that it would be impossible for me to have written this book, or even actually made this argument about big cats, had I not already done that work on ethnography of bureaucracy. Because there is a way, I thought this was a completely different project and I was not going to go down that, and it's a new thing I'm going to think about. And actually I found it impossible. I kept coming back to, for instance, the space of law and the ways in which non-human animals are constructed legally, or the kind of protection measures that you have there, or the kind of not necessarily protectionist measures, but other ways in which they imagine within the space of law, or within very dry sort of bureaucratic documents, on political speeches, or just the visuals of them that you see in these spaces, and they come to be part of it. So yeah, no, absolutely, that's a really important part of the story, which I didn't talk about here today, because here I'm trying to more think about the question of method, think about, how do we relate these different kinds of stories to something as big as the climate crisis and Anthropocene, trying to make a case for seeing the climate crisis perhaps in places and in stories and events that we might not necessarily see them in.
And I'm sorry, just a quick follow-up
Yeah,
to that. In the sense that I think that these bureaucracies are particularly interesting places to study these events, the events of the Anthropocene, particularly because you can see the juxtaposition between the 2 different knowledge systems, right? So when they are essentially kind of interacting with the the Teda Janwar, they are also having to file these really boring reports, and so why does that kind of intersection essentially exist, and how does that kind of talk help us think about the climate crisis that we have on our hands, essentially.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I mean, there's also something so interesting in that clashing of discourses, right? You have these dry bureaucratic forms, you have these files, you have these licenses, you have these IDs, you have these petitions. I mean, the petitions are quite affective and emotional because they're not written by bureaucrats. But you have these sort of very banal, everyday forms of knowledges, and then you have this perplexing non-human beast, right, who's there. And the way they sort of try to be disciplined in these documents is also something that's fascinating. But I'm also getting increasingly interested with and so, I feel including in my own work, I feel like there's a lot that I left out of that frame. And why did I do that? And is it because of a particular way that we are trained as social scientists, as ethnographers? Is it the ways in which disciplines operate that you see that but you don't see that? Or is it that there is something in the climate crisis that is invisibilized, that we find hard to get at? And this is why I think this push for different forms of writing, different kinds of stories is really important. Because I do think we need to change the way in which, at least I do, maybe not all of you, the ways, what we keep in the frame, and how we sort of shift scale, and how we talk about everyday life, and I don't think that I'm doing justice to what's happening in the Upper Himalaya if I do not center the climate crisis, because it's just there. But perhaps I just didn't have the tools as an ethnographer to write it in.
Hi, thank
Hi.
you so much. This was really interesting, and although I know nothing about the region basically, but as I'm really struck by the methodology and a new expression of multi-scalar scalar realities and shifting scales. So I'd like to hear more from you about that, because technically in my head a scale is something replicable, that it stays the same but gets bigger, or stays the same and gets smaller, and methodologically or ethnographically, how do we shift scales without reproducing the same neatness of that the climate crisis is unfolding differently, but it's similar at the same time, like to draw that very neat narrative that what happens to distortion if you change scale too much. And how do you keep that in?
That's a great question. That's a great question. Yeah, thanks for that. I think this is exactly right, because when we thought of scale earlier, it was like you scale up and the same thing is replicated at another scale. There is this, again, big discussion, the whole Anthropocene literature on what is scale, how do we use it, what does it mean to shift scale, etc. Perhaps I can talk about how I'm using it, and this is partly inspired by the work of Anna Singh's work. Of course, because I think the most interesting thing she does in her book on mushrooms, the mushroom book as I think of it, is that she shifts scale really well. So she's able to talk about mushrooms, she's able to talk about capital, she's able to talk about ecology, she's through quite a creative form of writing. So let me explain what I mean by when I say we need to shift scales here. And I'll give a specific example. So I'm using scale shifting not to talk about replicability, I'm using scale shifting to talk about understanding the local, the regional, the national, the sub-regional, or whatever you have to the global, as all enmeshed within a similar kind of what we're calling the climate crisis. And I am making an argument, I think what I'm interested in doing rather than my own project is trying to understand how something that is as bizarre as, say, bears, which are thieving bears, what do they tell us about the planetary crisis? And how do we shift that scale from that very almost, exotic, like incident of this bear comes into these people's house and steals things, or this big cat that has gone crooked and is attacking humans, that kind of jungle booky, Kipling-esque imagination. How do we move from that problematic colonial imagination to its ethnographic, or its empirical reality in the mountains right now? And we are able to then write in different kinds of scales. And by scales, I mean like the local politics, but national politics, regional politics, history, senses of time, the global, so to say, or the planetary rather, into this. And I don't think I've done it very well here or even in my book. And this is something I really want to think about methodologically. That I feel that, a part of the challenge of understanding the climate crisis is it's so big, right? Like there's something like a planet that is in crisis, and it's happening everywhere, is global warming. But how do we understand something that's so big through not its local manifestations and climate disasters, but through more sort of mundane, everyday political, economic, social processes? How do we read that into it? That's the kind of scale shifting I'm thinking of. But again, that's a really good question, and that's something that I'm actually genuinely going to be working on this year, is this question of how do we do this scale shifting, but also what exactly do we mean by scale? And I'm using a rough and ready idea of not of its replicability, but of different scales in relation to one another, and us finding the tools through which we're able to read them together and not as distinct. So not saying that this is this bizarre thing that's happening in this district here, and this has nothing to do with everything else that's happening nationally, or what that has happened 150 years back with empire, or that's happening with finance capital at this moment, but being able to read them together, if that makes sense. Zara, and then, and then.
So, my question is following up on my scale question, because I'm curious about how the people you're working with are also playing with scales, because you had this description of, the bureaucrats or people who are in agents of the state essentially saying, oh, it's climate change, whereas people who are affected by it, ordinary mountain people,
Not
are
necessarily,
talking about it being a conspiracy. And I think I really liked your description of who's the beast, because I think that's so much more of a creative way than asking like who's the agent of this or who is responsible. But in a way, in that playing of scale, in saying it's climate change, they're shifting scale away from a kind of localized responsibility, which is, of course, both are true, as you were saying. So I'm wondering how people are kind of doing that. That's part one of the question. And then part two is, this is a selfish one because I like thinking about individuals and when they appear. And so thinking of, the individualizing of these specific animals that's happening and the bureaucratic processes attached to that. What is that? I mean, what is that about? Like, why is that happening, do you think? And is it part of this attempt to kind of get a hold on this kind of irreconcilable, unwieldy, sort of out of scale problem to kind of track down and individualize?
Thanks, Sarah. Great questions. I'll combine them actually in a way because, funny way this sort of linked. So the individualizing, let me begin with that because I was also fascinated by that. And in the book, what I have is like after every 2 chapters, I have a beastly biography where I talk about an individual leopard or individual tiger, and I try to like write about their life because I'm fascinated by exactly as you picked up on the individualization of a particular tiger. Often they're named, but they're not always named, but they have personalities, not just tigers, but leopards, lions, etc. They have histories, they have biographies, they have stories about them, and they're highly individualized in the stories. Often, and very often through some form of naming practice, saying that, that one, or even if it'll just be like, the one who comes from this village, or like they would give them some sort of a pet name, like, I mean, there are all sorts of names that they have, which are also fascinating, and that's another story almost. And I wondered about this, so partly I think it is this tendency to anthropomorphize, but I think partly it comes from something which is the wider question I was interested in, which is that they say, the base question is that most big cats do not become crooked. There are only some that go crooked. And the question is, why do they become crooked? And in this answering of this question of why only some or that particular individual has gone crooked, I think to me opens out much bigger questions that I then frame through the Anthropocene narrative. Like, I think it opens out this thing of why is that happening? So in my interviews, I would go and say, why do you think this is happening? So on this question of, linked to your first question on scale or scale shifting. And they'd be like, and I found the responses fascinating. And in a way, that is what led me to write this book and to actually think about this current project. They would begin by, so suppose there was a crooked cat in a village and it has picked up a child and gone off. You go there, they're like angry, they're furious, they want that leopard killed immediately, they want it tortured, they want, some sort of direct retribution. They're very angry at the state for like allowing this to happen and for protecting big cats more than they protect humans, etc. But then if you keep going back, as I've been doing for all these years, and you talk to them more, there are very different kinds of stories that then come out, and actually very interesting different scales of understanding, right? So most of them will not use the term climate change, but they will talk about ecological collapse, like without terming it that. They will talk about corruption. There is a lot of discourse on corruption of the state. And, to go back to your question, Sangeeta, on like what the everyday state is and what is that doing there, about corruption of the state, corruption of politics, the defilement of the state. There is also reference to like big capital and where they will name particular kinds of industrialists, particular corporate houses, say, look, JP is going to build that big dam over there, and look at Adani is doing this, etc. So there's a way in which, again, to go back to the thing of individualization, there are these very dense narratives that come out there, and for me, I think it is in those dense narratives around this straightforward question of why is this individual cat acting the way it is, like why do you think they're doing that the scale shifting is happening for them. So on the one hand, it is about the local. It is about, someone's put an evil spell on them, or someone did some bad karma or something. It is also about the state politics of, the BJP or the Congress is in power and they're doing this and they're so corrupt and they have done that. And then there's also reference actually very interestingly to the British and to empire and all sorts of ways ki Angrezon ke time se chal raha hai. And there's a reference also to time. So I think in those narratives we can tease out that kind of scale shifting happening. A spatial scale shifting, but also a temporal one, with reference back. But and they also talk a lot about the future. But just wait and see. This is why my current project is called "The Death of the Himalaya," rethinking method in the climate crisis. Because there's this constant thing of you wait and see. When you come back next year, this will be gone, that will be dead, and that leopard would have eaten us all up. It would have done this. It would have done that. So there are these movement in time, and in attributing responsibility to different kinds of agents within these stories. Now, again, this is a question which you, again, as an ethnographer, might sometimes face. I felt it always with my work. Is it that I'm hearing this because I want to hear it, right? These are the ways I am interpreting it. This is my subjective reading of it. Someone else might go there and do these same interviews and not come away with that. And maybe that is the case. Maybe I am so obsessed with climate change that I'm hearing it, but I would like to think not. I would like to think that I've been led here through this ethnographic and long-term ethnographic work now, rather than the other way around. Yeah. So sorry, very complicated, complex, a mixed up answer to your two very good questions on individualization scale. Thanks.
So I'll also follow up on the scales question, but add kind of the institutional scales that so kind of brings your previous work and this work together. And just wanted to know, get a sense of how, when you went up and down kind of the bureaucratic scales, how did the valence or the conceptualization, you alluded to some of that, but I'm also thinking in a very literal way when we think of the Ministry of Environment and Forests, which in 2014 became the Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change. It was kind of just added on, and that's kind of almost, it almost like it's a literal sense of how when you go up the scale, there's this kind of, the conceptualization becomes broader, and there's this kind of, and then your current work around kind of the ethical underpinnings of bureaucracy, it also you're able to do that at that scale, but then at the very local, it's about managing, that particular compensation of a family that's been attacked by a, by a leopard or, a forest fire that has to be put out. So sort of how do these kind of nested scales of governance shift as we go up and down, and did you see that change when we go beyond, let's say, the state level? So you talked about the local and you talked about the state, but there's a lot now that there's a reconceptualization at kind of the national imagination of what it means to respond to a climate disaster. Even today, when the floods in Pakistan too, where there's a call for reparations. And I know these are two kind of just big questions, but I just wanted to know what you thought about.
Thanks.
About that.
Thanks, Anandita. So what's interesting in this, quite say unlike say the Pakistan floods or some of the other bigger disasters, even in Uttarakhand, right, where there is a way in which you can attribute this to climate change, and there'll be studies that will come out and say that 80% chances have increased because of climate change, there are heat waves or this floods, or we're 50% sure that it has increased this by whatever. There are all these ways in which you can attribute it to climate change. But something like with big cats or bears that are behaving inexplicably, there isn't really a similar kind of modeling system that you have available. Though, increasingly the World Wildlife Fund, etc., will be talking about how human-animal conflict, a term that I hate, but one has to use it, is increasing because of climate change. There is more and more, you'll see articles in Science, etc., or in these wildlife biology journals talking about in huge spikes in conflict because of climate change, and then they show the causality. But the big cat thing is also mired within an older colonial discourse of Jim Corbett and hunting and shikar stories, and it's in a romanticized understanding also of India as this place of tigers and leopards, etc. So I think that makes it quite different from, say, when I talk about the Kedarnath disaster, or where at different scales of the bureaucracy, they will quite easily talk about climate change in that sense, where they'll be like, yes, the glaciers are disappearing, and hence this has led to it, and there was unseasonal monsoon rain, and hence these disasters are happening. With the big cats, what happens is that you do have, in a way, more localized bureaucrats talking about climate change. And to be honest, they're normally doing it to depoliticize it, to say, hum kya kare? We can't do anything about it. This is climate change, and they're acting in funny ways. And I remember the first time I heard the climate change narrative was actually back in 2007 from a local forest, a DFO, basically a divisional forest officer, who said, this is happening more in the winters than in the summers, and the reason this is happening is because these leopards are coming down. It's too hot for them now because it's not cold enough in the upper Himalayas, it's not snowing enough or whatever. And they come down and they have no prey because of climate change and extinction, and they turn on humans. So, but I don't really see this actually. I'd say the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, at that level, in Delhi, etc., I haven't come across this narrative myself. But again, I haven't actually done that much work with them at that level. I've very much worked more locally in Uttarakhand. And what I found interesting there is that climate change is used quite strategically. It's used at points to actually, for the state to avoid responsibility, because it's so easy then, right? It's an ultimate depoliticization tool saying, it's climate change, what do? We are just some, pen-pushing bureaucrats sitting here. We can't do anything about it. So it's very interesting to see that. And at the international level, I think there is more and more argument about climate change leading to human-animal conflict. So it's very acceptable, but these kind of direct, kind of attributions, the way that, say, you're having for flooding or other kinds, or like hurricanes or other extreme events is not there quite yet. I remember when I sent my book out for review, one of the reviewers reviewer two, was like, basically, this has nothing to do with, what is she talking about? Climate change, Anthropocene, what is all this? There's nothing to do with that. India's always had man-eaters. And I was like, oh my God, how do I so you're basically undoing the entire premise of the work, anyway, thankfully the other reviewers didn't think that. But I find it fascinating because this was 4 years back, and then of course it went through many iterations, and I just don't see anyone being able to make that argument now, because I think even in such a short time, it is, even within academic spaces, it is becoming harder and harder to say this has nothing to do with climate change, right? But even 4 years back, an academic reviewer could come out and say, this has nothing to do with that. India's always had man-eating tigers. I was like, oh my God, who is this person? What is this, right? So I think there's also, again, it's also an interesting moment for us where I don't feel like I have to fight this argument that much. People take it, accept it in ways that they didn't. Right? Even though the argument has not changed for a few years. This has been something that's been quite evident in the Himalaya in a way for a while. So, yeah. So, anyway, I'm sorry, rambling answer to climate change and scale shifting, but yeah. Thank you. Hi.
Thank you so much for today's talk. I really enjoyed your use of beastly tales.
Thank you.
And I think it's so important to think through forms of storytellings as ways of kind of rendering ecologies of experience in ways that I think specifically anthropology as a discipline has an ability to do.
Yeah.
And I think what was most exciting for me in your use of beastly tales is that it kind of gives us a new way of thinking through the role of the mythological as the site in which the scales of the everyday and the scale of the global problem, say of climate change, becomes visible, but within the kind of realm of fiction. And I think your use of beastly tales kind of directs us to a new sort of relation between the mythical and the moral, because I think what both Vikram Seth and you do is to turn the fable on its head, in the sense that the animal or the non-human stops being this kind of metaphor or symptom of a human problem, but instead turns into a kind of agonistic presence via whom you're able to express, say, to the bureaucratic institution or to the state, a form of resistance, for example, because while you're able to kind of turn the problem into a story in which you kind of express, you're able to express, as you say, forms of doubt and uncertainty, you also have the simultaneous way of acknowledging that this is a kind of co-species who is also fighting to to feed itself.
Right.
So I was wondering if you would say a little bit more about how the category of the moral in relation to the human-animal kind of changes in this kind of aesthetic form of the tale as opposed to myth.
Yeah, thank you so much. What a lovely question, and so beautifully put. I mean, you put it much more beautifully than I would have with the use of the category of the beastly tale. I mean, I think I think that's a really nice way to read it, because the way I think of these stories or beastly tales is I prefer is, and I think I turned to beastly tales because initially I turned to them because I love Vikram Seth's work, and reading this was just, it's something that has been influential, but also because I think I read in the way that you did, that it didn't become a myth, but it became a way to see unexpected relationships which then have a moral to them without, but also in a really quirk in his book, they're quirky, they're not between animals you would think of necessarily, and the spin on it is so interesting. In the sort of my interviews and ethnographic work, I think what I found really interesting and really compelling was one was the density of the narratives, right? There wasn't a simple, straightforward story ever. There were different ones, there were different narratives, they were very dense. It took me a long time to sort of make sense of them. And I guess that is, if you do fieldwork in one area for a long time, you do get dense stories, whatever your topic, whatever your subject. But I think I found them particularly dense because there were so many things that they were trying to bring together. Or, to my mind, they bring together. Or, again, maybe I was reading them, but I think that they were trying to bring them together. And I found that, how do I write about them? How do I explain them to people who don't know the context, who don't know the language, who don't know, And I found the category of beastly tale really useful for that, because it allows you to pose certain questions like who's the beast of the tale. It allows you to also talk about these animals as, again, in an anthropomorphized way, as having their own moral systems that they work under, or their own compunctions that they're living under, their own agency for sure, but their own relationships to one another, to humans, to the environment that they live in, to the planet that they inhabit. So that was the way I read it. But yeah, thank you for your very beautiful comment and the reading of it.
Thank you so much for this talk. This gave me a lot to think with, and I don't think I'm asking you a question about scale, but I might be. So I apologize.
The whole talk on scale, yeah.
But I want to talk a little bit about the Anthropocene. I was really struck, and I appreciate when scholars sort of name their own kind of ambivalence or hesitance to adopt certain terms, or kind of adopt terms and then throw them away. And I was struck by towards the end of the talk, where you sort of named the Anthropocene as human mastery over nature. And the reason I think this word jumps out to me is because on the one hand, right, the literature on the Anthropocene is very much about collapsing distinctions. It's about universality in a way, right? If you want to read the Chakrabarti's work, right, it's about the collapsing of disciplines, the collapsing of difference, literally in some ways. And yet I'm struck by the examples that you sort of offer in the talk, which are about unevenness and about difference, right? The folks who are experiencing the brunt of climate change are the folks who have been sort of dispossessed from power for the last X number of centuries. And so I wonder how your project might be asking us to think about this category of difference, be it racial, gender, caste, class, etc., alongside the use of the term Anthropocene, because I think again, this is where I'm I might be skirting around this word scale, because I think to some extent, right, you're giving us this provocation that is, how do we think about the universal problem of the climate in the very particular, and here I use the word different, right, sort of manifestations of climate change. And the reason why I'm asking this question is because in part, it seems connected to this other provocation you have, which is, who produces good anthropology? And in my head, my question was, what is good anthropology? And I think if you think about the legacies of the discipline, right, as you're thinking about this project, it seems that part of the good in anthropology is also tied to how anthropology deals with the problem of difference.
Yeah, right. Thank you. Fantastic, wonderful comment again. So I should say the good anthropology was in quotes. I should have done the scare quotes, like, as a sarcastic thing of what is good and who defines what the good is. Exactly right. Yeah. Again, that's a really, really wonderful, creative way to think about it. That actually, I think I haven't thought about difference enough. I think I've thought about inequality here, and I've thought about scale a bit in terms of the different scales of it existing. But one way to really think about it, especially as I go forward with thinking about its implications for method, might be as a collapsing of difference, as you said, right? Or the accentuation of certain forms of differences. So I think the latter is something that I have thought a lot about, and in a way, this project also comes from a sense of rage that you feel when you go there, and it's exactly as you said, that people who have had absolutely nothing to contribute to this are bearing the brunt in absolutely horrific ways, and they're invisibilized. They are just these ghost villages, and like the kinds of stories behind each of the ghost villages of why people are abandoning them and leaving, and the kind of horrific situations they're living in the plains, unemployment, complete displacement, etc. There's that everyday mundane form of what the climate crisis is doing. Of course, you have the spectacular disasters, you have the floods, you have the other things which are also horrific in their own ways. In a way, this project is birthed out of this anger at the inequality which is intrinsic in it, and the deep injustice at the very heart of the climate crisis, where, the people, as you're saying, the ones who are most vulnerable, the most different in terms of position, class, caste, race, gender, etc., the ones who are least equipped to deal with it or to find ways to adapt. That again, a thing I hate, the whole climate adaptation narrative around it. I think your question is, I don't think it's necessarily on scale. I think it's a really interesting question on thinking about difference within it. And I have to say, I have not thought of it that way, but it's going to be really useful for me as I go forward, thinking about, especially about methodological difference, right? Because again, that is something I keep coming back to and I've not done enough with, which is that how do you collapse these distinctions between different disciplines, like between climate science and ethnography, or between poetry and geography? How do we maybe not collapse the differences, but how do we make them speak to one another in some form? Or, how do we translate these forms of knowledges across domains? Because I think we do need to do that if we want to understand what life and death in the Anthropocene consists of. So, yeah, but thank you. That was a really wonderful comment again. Oh.
Thank you so much for your talk. Yeah, it was related to what was just asked. So, I studied geology and climate science, cool. And so I find that a lot of times I take a lot of anthropology and sociology classes that it's treated as two separate things.
Yeah.
Like that's the climate science, that's the IPCC, that's going to inform the policy. And a lot of the peers that I work with are very, from the geology side, are a bit, I wouldn't say ignorant, but are just uninformed completely about the people. And I find that sometimes how people are affected by climate change should inform the science too, but it's always science informing people. So, and you said you work with geologists, so I was wondering what do you think we can do to challenge that from the more geology science side that has been informed in a very certain way that builds a very one type of narrative, and what we can do to change that as well.
Yeah. Great question, and something again I've been struggling with for a while. So for the last 3 years at Cambridge, I've been part of this research network, which is called at Oxford, which is called Climate Crisis Thinking in the Humanities and Social Sciences. And our project is trying to do this. It's trying to get natural scientists, humanities scholars, and social scientists to sit on the same table, so to say, and discuss climate change and try to work together. And it's been absolutely impossible. It's such an uphill task, right? Because as you're saying, the scientists have one way of understanding it, and the humanities scholars also resistant in their own way, and so the social scientists. And I don't know. I feel exactly as you're describing it. We've tried to co-write. We've tried to talk about this need for sort of translation across disciplines, but it seems incredibly hard to do. And exactly as you're saying, it's really problematic because, the science needs to be informed by other knowledge forms. And I also think, for instance, as an anthropologist, that we need to read a bit more of geology. And, I've learned a lot from speaking to geologists and glaciologists. I've just understood a lot of things that I didn't earlier. And I think we need to do that kind of work, but it's also incredibly hard to do. So I have absolutely no answer other than to say that I feel exactly the same on the same very, rough, choppy terrain of struggle around this.
Okay, so unless anyone else has a question, I just want to have one tiny follow-up question,
please.
right?
Yeah.
So it's about the ghost towns.
Yeah.
So ghost villages. Sorry. So we have this narrative of ghost towns in the U.S., right? Like in post-industrial derelict, where people just essentially fled these spaces because of the urban decay, etc. But here, I actually want to know a little bit more about why they were abandoned.
Yeah.
And also, the juxtaposition of these, this forms of slow everyday violence with the kind of episodic hazards that are environmental hazards that we kind of in the Kedarnath flooding, etc. we see, right? So there's a juxtaposition in which we kind of actually see the difference between the ways in which climate change is actually impacting this region. But in this story, I also kind of following up from Brian, I just want to kind of also say that there is a sense of othering that is going on in the narratives of the villages as well, right? The plains people are sending up the old animals and who are not acquainted with living in the mountains, etc. So there is that division in between us and them. And I kind of wanted to kind of help. I want to kind of think through that ideation. So why do you think that is, and how does that kind of relate to the villages that are being abandoned? Who are in all possibility actually moving over to the plains as well. So just that kind of.
No, so that's Sangeeta, there's a long history to the plains and mountain sort of animosity, and very rightly so, where they talk about how people from the plains have stolen the resources and dammed the rivers for electricity in the cities, or cut down timbers, for things which are happening downstream, etc. And just also genuinely the political ways in which the state has been governed. So Uttarakhand, as you know, was formed as a state, was carved out of Uttar Pradesh, and there was this whole argument which was made one argument that was made was that they want their own kind of specific development, which is a mountain development. Though, of course, as people like Emma Maudsley have shown, that actually what was happening was that this was an anti-reservation backlash, right, because of the caste composition of the mountains in her very wonderful work on the creation of Uttarakhand. So the ghost villages, the reasons, if you were to go, when I go and talk to people, they'll say it's unemployment. It's, there is nothing here. The younger generation doesn't want to live there anymore. They want to go and live in the plains, and they don't necessarily have the same relationship to the mountains, or the same history with it that others do. They talk about how there's absence of any kind of class progression, any aspirations to a middle class life is not possible there. You can't go to the cinema, you don't have, proper roads, etc., things like that. But they will also talk about, things like the leopards that are entering, or the fact that wild boars are attacking their farmsteads, etc. And again, they won't make direct attributions to climate change or to things that are associated with it. They won't say that because of climate change we're leaving. But they will name this together, which to me, in my interpretation, and I might be completely wrong, but I would read them as part of the climate crisis. And I want to read them as part of that, because I think I can't write them out, though I'm happy to be told I'm wrong on that, and that's fine, that's my interpretation. So that, and then what I find again interesting is that the big disasters, of course, they talk about them as horrific, and in some cases they're life-changing, right? Because your village is swept off, then obviously that's the end. But I think in the big disasters, there is a way in which there is this whole language of apadda, or of disaster in the mountains, where you have them in a seasonal way. So when you have the monsoons, there's some sort of apadda, that a disaster that happens, etc. They do talk about them, and I won't say that they're not important, but actually it's these everyday struggles of not getting water, not getting electricity, of being scared to go into the fields because of the monkeys, because of the wild boar, because of the leopards, because of the bears. It's that kind of change in the daily life that they really talk a lot about. But again, I think the question you're sort of asking, the broader question, that's a really important one, which has, is that what is leading to these forms of abandonment? And I think it would be wrong to point to just one thing or two things. I think there are a spate of things happening together, and which has led to this. And I need to study them more, because I don't think I've studied ghost villages as deeply as I should have. Yeah.
It's like the birds migrating, when there is a disaster essentially.
Yeah.
Emerging.
Yeah.
So the birds kind of sense that and travel. So anyway, sorry. Okay. Anyone has any more questions?
Hi.
I found it very interesting when you talked about the use of climate change as a term to depoliticize
Yes.
what occurs. And
Yeah.
that makes me wonder the role of the expert and the way people who actually suffer through the crises are, termed in various ways as
Yeah.
not understanding enough, and all of these discourses take agency away, and it's such, and I don't understand the discourse around scale as much, but it's such a big scale problem in a sense that the whole way in which conservation science operates is around this very particular way of looking at human-nature relationships, and that's sort of what informs bureaucracy, and that's what the dominant narrative is. I needed to come to ground and then start seeing the perspectives on the other side. So I think similar to what Amy asked as well, but with all of the years in which you've worked there, has there been a shift in the way environmental justice conversations occur, and or not even the conversation between disciplines, but just looking at the crisis and the scale at which it occurs, as you said, it's the daily struggles and not just the bigger disasters. Has there been a shift, or what does that look like at all?
Yeah. Again, really great question. I think this question of climate justice, environmental justice is finally gaining ground in the mountains in a way that I hadn't necessarily seen during the time I'd worked there earlier. So I believe that during the time of the Chipko movement, that the movement to protect the trees, there was a very strong narrative around environmental justice, what we would term environmental justice now. But it was very much about resources and resource extraction and stopping that and leaving the resources with the people who actually live in the local area. But of late, there is much more of a talk around questions of climate justice, which again is coming in through particular kinds of external experts, so through NGOs, through academics, and I think that's doing some interesting political work in terms of pushing back against the capacity of the bureaucratic use of climate change to depoliticize. Because my earlier, when I would see this use of climate change, it was very much to depoliticize. It was a way for the local state to say, we can't do anything about it. This is like a global problem. It's happening everywhere. The Himalayas are dying and collapsing, and we can't do anything about it. So it was very much a way to abdicate responsibility. But of late, what is becoming more and more interesting to me is to see that there's a discourse on climate change that also local politicians are picking up politically. They're not doing it to lead to the depoliticization, but to say that we need some form of action in the Himalaya that wasn't there earlier. We were discussing this in the context of Mumbai as well, where a Shiv Sena government, certain members of the Thackeray family are very invested in climate change, and it is having very real political impacts, right? Within local states, within NGOs, etc. What these are, I have not myself traced. I haven't done that ethnographic labor of tracing what the impact is, but I think it's changing that terrain around it. Which again goes to show that these expert discourses that might come from outside, might be couched in a different language, actually go on to have very important political effects in places, and it's important to understand what they are. They don't always need to be progressive, but they upset the field in one form or the other, and they allow for other kinds of contestations or claims to be made, which is really important in this moment, I think, because we need a new vocabulary to talk about the scale of injustice and the scale of damage, and and just the sort of the horrors of everyday life. We literally need a new language to be able to talk about it. So, yeah. Yes.
I was wondering, as I was talking as well, I was wondering how, with all of these dense narratives, the fact that it's only one thing.
Right. Yeah.
And they're happening in motion, so it's displacement and migration and unemployment, poverty, climate,
Right.
all of these things
Yeah.
together. And as some of the discourse around floods is also like that.
Yeah.
In Pakistan, and they're compounding.
Yeah.
You have a debt crisis.
Yeah.
The island or the island equivalent of flood.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
this is kind of
Yeah.
endless barrage of,
Yeah.
and it's surreal. I mean, there's
Yeah.
there's compounding of it, which makes it even more difficult to address one thing without the others. But in anthro and other disciplines, there's been this, response to crisis.
Right.
And crisis as a category and what it does, and anti-crisis Freudman and all of that. And I'm wondering how you're dealing with that, with the climate change
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah.
And then the second question is following up on
Yeah.
Ryan's excellent point on replacing difference in
Yeah.
anthro and a good anthropology, or less bad anthropology. I feel like there's been this weird commitment to alterity in anthro
Right.
forever.
Yeah.
It seems a little inescapable, and I feel like the story that you're telling is shifting that in some extent. But there seems to be this making sense of what is happening, going back to the individualizing and the anthropomorphizing, especially around Anthropocene. With what was it? The forest skimping and the jaguar situation. That there's there's an other here that you
Right.
can't, the ontological.
Right. Yeah.
And its connection to the Anthropocene. And
Right.
how you're situating your reading of the Anthropocene, potentially, in opposition to that, how you're thinking with
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Great questions again, Zara. So, I mean, I think the first one on crisis, and again, as you know, that there's been one way to think about crisis, and again, this was, I think, very much my initial take on the whole crisis narrative, is that you can say we're always in crisis and everything is a crisis, and especially in the Himalayas, there's a very long-standing narrative of environmental crisis, which in a way is also true of certain kinds of states which are always perpetually in crisis, or certain places are thought to always have some form of crisis, right? Economic crisis, ecological crisis. There's a very long history of this understanding of the Himalayas always dying and collapsing. So in a way that, and there's a critical, again, as you know, a critical anthropological take on what crisis does, what are the political uses it's put to, is it really a crisis, the power of naming something as a crisis, what are the choices we're making when we say it's climate crisis instead of something else. And I've sort of thought a lot with that work and thought a lot about the kind of naming practices I'm adopting or the framing that I'm using here. And I have struggled with it, gone back and forth, and been like, for instance, is climate crisis the right word? Is the Anthropocene the right framing, right? And I find them both inadequate, but I find them also compelling enough to be able to name a particular reality that I think needs to be named. And I think this is a thing that as anthropologists we always face, right? Or as social scientists, as people who do field work, or you don't even have to do field work. I think as just someone who's trying to describe a social world, right? That how do you describe it? What frames are you using? What things are you naming? How do you term it that? And I always struggle with it, and I'm not sure even after the book is published whether this is the right way to do it. But I think it is the best of the options available. It is the best vocabulary that's there. I also think that there is something within the climate crisis thing and the Anthropocene frame that allows for a politicization of this moment and allows for us to center the deep damage that has been done by humans on the planet, just like put it front and center, which I think needs to be done. And so for instance, and I thought in this book in particular, I felt like it needed to be done because there's a lot of work on multi-species ethnography, on the post-human, on the non-human, etc., which is wonderful and really rich and beautiful. But I am a bit disgruntled with how it doesn't actually work at this planetary level, how it doesn't, like, you don't really have the climate crisis in it, right? These become very localized or historical relationships between humans and non-humans that are there. And I think those are very important, and I've learned a lot from these, this wonderful work which in South Asia on the non-human. But I cannot imagine talking about these big cats outside the climate crisis. And I think to do so would be a form of violence. It would be a form of writing out that which is really important to center. At the same time, I'm also very conscious of the fact that the term crisis is used very loosely. It can be used in other ways. Does climate crisis really capture it? I don't know. But I think it's the best possible frame, So I think that's how I think of it. On the ontological turn, again, like I'm not a big fan of it. Let's put it that way. And I haven't found it necessarily very productive for the kind of ethnographic work I have. And now I don't know whether this is because South Asia is very different from the Amazon. I don't know whether it is that my interests are very different from what's happening in other parts of the world. I have to have sidestepped it because I find that to deal with that kind of literature, which is very different from my work, would just take up too much space and energy for me because I don't find it relevant in a way for what I'm doing. I'd rather deal with what geologists are saying or with what a wildlife biologist has to say about big cat, biology, because I find that more pertinent. But that could be this project. Our projects also shift and yeah. And again, these are choices. In a way, both your questions are so interesting because they are about the kind of choices we make, the choices we have to make as anthropologists. With what tools do we work? What frames do we use? And why do we use these and not others? And my answer to that is always that I think we should use the terms and theories and concepts and frames that we think do most justice to ethnographic work, to that which, and I think that's what I've tried to do. But again, as you said, I think we should all also be open to revising and discarding concepts, because I go back and we were discussing this again with my earlier work on the bureaucracy and the state, and I think there are so many ways we were discussing actually with Anantita. There are ways in which I might have written it differently now, right? So because times also change, you look at things differently, but yeah, it is what it is, as we say. That's a perfect ending.
So, thank you, Nayanika, for coming here and sharing your emerging work with us, and also to inspire, to inspire us to actually work towards a less bad anthropology.
You have to quote Zara on that. Yeah, less bad.
And also keep revising our method to actually try and incorporate some of the crises that surround us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me here, and thank you all for these wonderful comments and questions. They were wonderful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate them.